Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Closing the Energy and Transportation Affordability Gap for Connecticut's Low and Moderate Income Households. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. And before we pass it over to our excellent group of speakers today, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can connect using your computer, mic, and speakers, or you can call in using a telephone. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled here, and you can also click on that to expand the webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do on your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. You can type those into the questions panel and hit send. We encourage you to type your questions and comments in throughout the webinar. We'll be saving some time following the presentations for a Q&A with the audience, and we want to get to as many questions as we can. So please do submit those. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will have the webinar recording and slides posted on our website probably within 48 hours, and we'll send those to you via email, and we'll also post them on CESA's website at cesa.org/webinars. That is also a good URL to know because it is where we post info about our upcoming and archived webinars. So with that, I'd like to now turn it over to our host for today's webinar, Abby Ramanan. Abby is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and she is going to get us started. Over to you, Abby.
Thanks, Sam. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this webinar. So a bit of background, the Clean Energy States Alliance is an organization primarily made up of state energy offices. You can see their logos all listed here. And this particular webinar is part of our State Energy Strategies program, which is funded through a grant from the DOE Office of Solar Technologies. So under the SES project, CESA is working with 5 states, including Connecticut, Minnesota, New Mexico, Oregon, and Rhode Island in the District of Columbia, to develop and implement low and moderate income solar strategies. This project is winding down in 2020, and we hope to be able to share a lot more webinars, reports, and lessons learned from this project through the next year. So I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. We have Emily Basham, who is the Manager of Partnership Development at the Connecticut Green Bank. She works across sectors in the organization to develop new partnership program opportunities to grow clean energy deployment. She primarily manages the community campaigns for the Solar for All program to increase LMI solar energy efficiency adoption, and the Solar Municipal Assistance Program, which is supporting Connecticut's towns and cities. Gannon Long is the Director of Policy and Public Affairs for Operation Fuel, which is a statewide organization offering energy and water utility assistance to LMI families in Connecticut. Prior to that, she was the Assistant Coordinator at Transport Hartford, which is a program at the Center for Latino Progress that advocates for multimodal transportation safety and access in the region. Justine Sears is a consultant with VEIC, who joined VEIC in 2012. She leads research and implementation projects related to clean transportation and energy programs. Her work focuses on equity, affordability, and bringing clean energy technologies to LMI populations. And then Jennifer Wallace-Broder is a manager at VEIC's consulting division, and she oversees their transportation electrification work. She sets a strategic direction for VEIC's clean transportation programs and helps lead the team's efforts to reduce the environmental and economic impacts of energy use in the transportation sector. And now I will hand it over to Emily to introduce a bit of information about the Connecticut Green Bank and VEIC and Operation Fuel.
Thanks, Abby. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Basham. I'm a Manager of Partnership Development at the Connecticut Green Bank. Welcome to the webinar. We're so glad to have all of you this afternoon, and we're very excited to share this study, Mapping Household Energy and Transportation Affordability in Connecticut, which was produced for the Connecticut Green Bank by VEIC with guidance from Operation Fuel. And Justine from VEIC will present the findings of the study here shortly. And Gannon Long from Operation Fuel will describe, how these findings are impacting low and moderate income families here in the state. But before we dive in, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context. The Connecticut Green Bank is a quasi-public state agency, and we provide financing for clean energy projects. And more recently, we've been having an increasing focus on delivering these clean energy benefits to the state's vulnerable communities. And Operation Fuel's mission is really to ensure that equitable energy access to energy occurs for all by providing year-round energy and utility assistance. So this topic today is really close to both of our missions. In 2017, Operation Fuel released the Home Energy Affordability Gap Study, which really helped us here in Connecticut understand how energy costs really burden LMI families. And so the Connecticut Green Bank wanted to build on this critical research and expand the study to look at also not just energy, but transportation. VEIC also did a supplemental analysis of the Connecticut Green Bank's low and moderate income incentive program, including our Solar for All program. So we'll touch on that and really wanted to understand how that can be a solution for energy burden. And that analysis was funded by one of our DOE grants and in coordination with CISA. So the goal of the study is really to understand how these costs are burdening our residents, by how much, and take a cursory look at what programs in our state exist to address these costs. With growing income inequality in Connecticut, we're the third highest in the nation, and high energy costs, energy affordability is really a pressing issue. We're hopeful that this report is informative to our fellow Connecticut stakeholders in shaping or reshaping programs. And this is also a familiar narrative to outside of our state. So we welcome national listeners to this, to think about what is similar in our findings here in Connecticut as your state as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Justine to really dig into the study.
Hi, everyone. This is Justine. All right. So let's see if I can advance this. So as Emily mentioned, so this slide is not.
If you wiggle your mouse over that,
okay.
There you go. Just click on the first slide on it. Do it. You got it.
Okay.
And you've got to click on the first slide to advance it, and after that, it will. There you go. You got it.
There. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's fine. So yep. So this is Justine. I work at VEIC. We're a nonprofit based in Vermont. We have offices in Ohio and DC. These are my colleagues. Jennifer is on the line today. Leslie was not able to join us, but we worked on this study together. The bulk of the work that VEIC does is implementation work. We implement efficiency and renewable programs. But we also have a consulting division, and that's where Jen and I do our work. And that work can be analysis, policy recommendations, and the hope a lot of times is that it can kind of feed into and further our implementation work. So here in Connecticut, we're looking at burden and affordability gap. So those are the two metrics that I'll be talking about today. burden. I think that's probably familiar to most people. That's spending expressed as a percentage of income. So you can have an energy burden, a housing burden, childcare burden. And we also looked at affordability gap, and that was a metric that was new to me, and it really came out of the previous work that Operation Fuel had done. And that's the difference between an affordable level of spending and actual spending levels. So it's not the total amount spent, it's just that gap between what's considered affordable and the amount that's actually being spent. And it's a really tangible metric, I think, because it's expressed in dollar values, and it can kind of help policymakers, I think, kind of wrap their arms around a problem instead of it just seeming this kind of amorphous, oh my gosh, energy levels are unaffordable. Oh, actually they're, we can, once we have a sense of the gap that we're dealing with, I think we can start to come up with really targeted solutions. So as Emily mentioned, this study came out of a study that was done in 2017, focusing on low-income households in Connecticut, looking at building energy, so heating and electricity. And that study estimated about a $450 million affordability gap for energy. And so we were interested in revisiting that and updating for 2020, but we included transportation costs in that for a few reasons. It's the second highest household expense for most households. There are few programs that exist currently to assist the same way that we offer fuel assistance. And it's also the #1 contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in Connecticut, the transportation sector is. And in my opinion, I really think of energy affordability as not so much, I mean, part of it is helping people meet their needs each month so that, basic needs are met, but I also think of it as building wealth, and allowing families to save. So the scope of this study, we had 3 spending categories, and we were looking at them. We were interested in kind of geographic patterns across the state. So we looked at building energy, transportation comprehensively, so energy, but also other spending on transportation, housing, which was not a thrust of the study, but we included as an expense. And we used the 2 metrics I mentioned earlier, burden and affordability gap. So sorry, that map is a little fuzzy, but our unit of study, our geographic unit, was census tract. And that's a unit that is used by the US Census as they track population and other demographics. So each census tract has a few thousand people in it, and there's about 830 census tracts across Connecticut. So it's, I think, a pretty fine, granular unit of analysis. And this is just to give you a sense of the data sources that we used. For building energy, so for heating and electricity, we got estimates of spending through the LEAD tool, which was a tool developed by DOE, and it provides estimates of spending for different income levels at a variety of geographies. So we took their estimates of spending on heating and electricity for each census tract in the state. For transportation, we use the Housing and Transportation Affordability Index, which is a very similar tool for housing and transportation. It's maintained by the Center for Neighborhood Technology, which is a nonprofit based in Chicago. And through that tool, in a very similar fashion, so for each census tract in the state, we could get estimates of spending on transportation and housing. And then household income came from the American Community Survey, which is an annual survey conducted by the US Census. And that kind of income provides the denominator to all of our equations. So that's what we're grounding our estimates of burden and affordability gap in. So these are the affordability thresholds that we used. And I'm not trying to, so we're going to be in the weeds a little bit here, and then hopefully that will make the results clear and compelling if we can just make it through all of these different thresholds and metrics. So our affordability thresholds were based in the literature as much as they could be. So for each spending category, we have a threshold. So for building energy, that includes household heating and electricity, and the affordability threshold that we used was 6%. So you shouldn't be spending more than 6% to heat and cool your home on a monthly basis. And that 6% threshold actually came out of the study that Operation Fuel did in 2017, and has since been adopted pretty widely within the industry. I know ACEEE uses it, NYSERDA uses it, or the firm, I guess, that did the study for Operation Fuel really kind of created that 6% threshold. Our transportation threshold, so within the spending category of transportation, it's really a comprehensive cost category. We looked not just at transportation energy or vehicle fuel, but transit costs and all the costs associated with owning a vehicle. So purchase or lease, insurance, and maintenance. And granted, those are highly, highly variable, but we took the estimates that were available through the H&T index. And also based on that index, we used an affordability threshold of 15% of household income. For housing, we used 30%. That's a widely used metric. And it's worth noting that's total shelter cost. So that is all of the costs associated with your housing, including heating your home. So it includes that 6% of building energy, insurance, taxes, all of your costs are included in that 30%. And then these, I think, so this 15% and that 30% add up to a 45% affordability threshold of energy, transportation, and housing. So within those three buckets of spending, that includes your total shelter costs and your total transportation costs. You shouldn't be spending more than 45% of your income in order to fall within an affordable threshold or affordable level of spending. So, and I think there's a little bit, so the H&T index where we pulled these thresholds, there's a little bit of play here. I think the idea being that if your housing costs tend to be high, maybe if you live in a dense urban area, your housing costs might be high, but your transportation costs should be lower. So you can still kind of fall within an affordable threshold. There's a little bit of play between that 30% and 15%. So in our affordability analyses, we used that 45% total. So those are our methods. I'll move into results. For building energy, we estimated on average folks are spending about $3,000 per year. That equated to about a 4% building energy burden, so within the realm of affordable. We saw a lot more variability in spending on electricity than heating. I think that's because electricity actually is a pretty common source of heat in Connecticut, and much greater variability among low-income households. So this is a look at building energy burden by income. So this is income band relative to the statewide median. I don't think it's a huge surprise, but as income goes up, burden goes down. And this dotted line is that 6% affordable threshold. So we see right around 60 to 80% of statewide median income spending becomes affordable. We did find that among low-income households, the energy burden was 6 to 7 times higher than the statewide average. So this is a map of those same results. So this is on these maps, each little piece here is a census tract. And this is a map of building energy burden by census tract. So these blue areas are census tracts where the energy burden is well below that affordability threshold. So less than 3%, less than half of what's considered affordable. The blue areas are kind of, or the yellow areas are kind of right in the middle, 3 to 6%. And it's these red areas that on average, households in those tracts are experiencing a high energy burden, so 6 to 10% or over 10%. And we see clusters of those in the state's urban areas. So this is Hartford, this is New Haven, this is Bridgeport, and this over here is affordability gap. So a very similar map, it just doesn't call out those blue areas. But you see the same clusters, and it puts a dollar amount on those burdens. So in these orange clusters, people are facing affordability gaps. These are annual gaps of $500, and then it goes up to $1,000 and over $1,000 in these bright red tracts. So those are tracts where most households are facing unaffordable energy bills in excess of $1,000. And I think we have a close-up here. So this is Hartford County, and I think if you look on this slide, most of the county is blue or yellow, but when you look at downtown Hartford, you have a cluster, and it's the most densely populated area of the state we estimate to be about 33,000 households that are highly burdened. So those are households where the burden is up to 10%, over 10% annually. We also looked at building energy affordability with statewide by income band, and this allowed us to estimate an aggregate statewide affordability gap for building energy, and very similar results to the previous study. We estimated about $444 million over what affordable spending levels would be, and that was present in income bands below 60% of the statewide median income. And it works out to be about $1,000 per household, so in excess of an affordable level of spending. So for transportation, these are the spending categories that we considered. Vehicle ownership. So vehicle ownership alone made up about 15% of a household's spending on an annual basis. So they've already hit the affordability threshold just in owning a vehicle. Fuel was similar to building energy. It was about 4% of spending or of income. Transit was less than 1%, and so that adds up to about a 20% transportation burden on average, which is in excess of the 15% affordability threshold. So the map is not pretty, very different from the building energy map. So this is burden on the left, and we see large swaths of the state are deemed unaffordable. So these are census tracts where most households are facing unaffordable levels of transportation spending. This area in the southeastern part of the state so burden was consistently below 10%. We've got a big cluster of blue there. But I think what's so different about the transportation map from building energy is just how widespread unaffordability is. So it's in rural areas. We see those same clusters in urban areas. So that's Hartford and New Haven. So in these areas, transportation burden is in excess of 20%, even 25%. And I think what's important to note is that the data that we use doesn't so much, it's not so much a reflection of how much people are spending more than so much as it's about what they would need to spend to achieve an acceptable level of mobility. So folks in Hartford may not be spending 25% of their income on transportation, but they also might not be able to get where they need to go. So that acceptable level of mobility includes being able to get to work, being able to get to the grocery store, get to the doctor. And then here on the affordability gap, so similar map, it just puts a dollar value on those burdens. So spending levels in excess of $2,500 of what would be considered affordable, and then up to excess of $5,000. And you see these clusters of orange and red in the urban areas, but also rural areas, suburban areas, really pervasive across the state. We looked at transportation spending, so this is statewide by, I guess this is by census tract by AMI band. So this is increasing incomes, so increasing AMI area median income band, and then this is the estimated affordability gap. And I think what was most striking about this to me was how just how pervasive the affordability gap was. So in households, so in census tracts that are earning 60%, where the median income is 60% less than the area median income, we estimate an affordability gap of about $5,000 annually. And that gap persists into census tracts earning 100% of area median income. And it's not until you're well above that to 120% of AMI that that affordability gap goes away. So that, I think, is a striking result, that even beyond households that we traditionally think of as low or moderate income, affordability is an issue when it comes to transportation. So this is a combined map of energy, transportation, and housing, using the thresholds that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. And again, so we see that even households above traditional low-income thresholds are struggling with the combined affordability of building, energy, transportation, and housing. So on this map, we see this as a similar pattern to transportation, a little less acute, I think, but clusters of bright red census tracts in Hartford, in New Haven, and then rural areas that are also facing unaffordable levels of spending. And this is the breakdown of spending. This is statewide, just on average, and it looks similar to what you would expect, what I would expect. So shelter costs make up the most. This dark blue is housing, and then the light blue is building energy. And then this dark red is transportation, with the light red being fuel or gasoline. And then transit is such a small sliver at $100, you can't quite see it. But clearly, one way to improve affordability for households in Connecticut would be to reduce their transportation costs. If we could get that well below 20%, I think we could make a lot of progress. So that's $35,000 in total. And then this is another figure that's combining costs on transportation, building, energy, and housing. So the costs are the blue bars, and this is spending. And then on the x-axis, we have income band. And then the green bar is remaining income. And there's a lot going on in this figure, but it's worth taking the time to understand it. It's telling a number of compelling stories, I think. So we see income. So first, I guess we could start with spending on transportation, energy, and housing. It increases a little bit over as income increases, but we see remaining income increases dramatically as incomes go up. And total burden, so this is total burden, so that would be measured relative to the 45% affordability threshold, starts at 68% for households earning at 60%, less than 60% AMI, and it really doesn't hit affordable levels until about 80 to 100% AMI. And this is just we have one slide on the supplemental analysis we did looking at the Green Bank solar program. They have a low and moderate income solar program, which we reviewed, and estimated annual savings. And so here we have savings on the y-axis. The blue bars are savings that are attributed to solar, and then the orange bars are savings attributed to efficiency upgrades, so retrofits or deep efficiency measures. And the Solar for All program, we estimated, based on the program data provided by the Green Bank, that average annual savings were about $1,300 for those households, which is enough to close the affordability gap, even for the lowest income households. So we estimated that gap to be about $1,000 per household, and these annual savings are above that, which I thought was good news. So in conclusion, we saw energy burden highest among low-income households. That wasn't a surprise, but at 6 to 7 times higher, I thought that was a surprise to me. We saw high building energy burdens clustered in urban areas, but the combining efficiency and solar programs can essentially close that building energy affordability gap for many low and moderate income households. We saw high transportation costs across the state, and reducing those costs is crucial to preserving affordability. Certainly the biggest driver of those high transportation costs was reliance on a personal vehicle. I don't think there was a single census tract in the state that was deemed, there was no place where you could live and have an adequate level of mobility without owning a personal vehicle. And that was what was driving the high transportation costs that we saw. I'm going to hand it over to Emily now. I think she's going to take policy and program recommendations.
Thanks, Justine. So there are a few policy recommendations in this study. We've got a range of programs that exist here in Connecticut to help households really chip away at their energy burden, either direct fuel assistance, weatherization, solar incentives, and encourage folks to look at the study to see all of those programs tabled out and their associated savings. But at current funding levels, existing programs really can't bridge the gap for all households that need assistance. So a good place to start is, how do we expand these programs, or how do we better layer these programs to help close that gap? As Justine mentioned, Solar for All program closes the gap for many households. How can we serve more households, or how can we expand solar and energy efficiency services to renters? Connecticut, we're just about to kick off our Shared Clean Energy Facilities program, which is our community solar program to help expand clean energy benefits to renters. It's a 25 megawatt a year program, so it will help a lot of our households, but we've got a lot more remaining that we need to help. And we saw really clear areas to target, saw clusters in urban areas that are really hot spots of burden. So we really need more programming and assistance in these areas. The next slide, Justine. There we go, thanks. For transportation, it's a really different picture. The gap is really broad, so it's present in rural areas and urban areas. It's spanning income bands, so really a sweep of solutions is needed there. The report offers a few considerations, generous income eligible EV programs. There's some other states that are noted for us to keep an eye on, California and New York. Income eligible electric bikes could really be part of the solution. There's no one transportation solution that will work for every household. As Justine mentioned, the affordability issues for transportation are really, really variable, but e-bikes will always be cheaper to own and maintain than a vehicle. So that's maybe one option, and they're financially more sustainable in a lot of ways. Expanding transit is obvious. We need to kind of think beyond the 40-foot buses to micro transit options There's really a lot of healthy ideas here in Connecticut that we can piece together to help chip away at the transportation cost, which is kind of one of the larger findings in this report, is helping to kind of shed light on those numbers and help encourage the state to move in these directions. So that's the overview of the program and policy recommendations. And I'm going to turn it over to Gannon to kind of talk about the bigger picture.
All right, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Just take that. Take your silence as affirmation. Thank you. First, thank you so much to Abby, Samantha, and CISA for organizing this event for us. And thank you all to the guests for joining and being here today. And I also want to thank Emily and the Green Bank and VEIC. Justine, your presentation was great. Just really appreciate your partnership on this work. So hey, everybody, my name is Gannon Long. I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Director for Operation Fuel in Hartford. We're a statewide organization providing energy assistance to low and moderate income residents of Connecticut. And prior to this position, I was with Transport Hartford at the Center for Latino Progress. I'm also getting my MBA at UConn. So why is Operation Fuel, primarily an energy affordability organization, focusing on the transportation burden? The short answer is that transportation costs, both explicit and implicit, impact our clients and folks like them around the state. So transportation costs can be very highly variable. They're also a larger percentage of household budget. And so that has a big impact on the cost of living for our clients and other low and moderate income or LMI families in our state. Transportation is also a systemic barrier that keeps a lot of Connecticut residents from accessing necessary services. And while there are various energy assistance programs, including federal LIHEAP funds, Operation Fuel, there's very little similar support for transportation, despite the larger costs. Wealth inequality, you all may know, in Connecticut is higher than just about in any other state. And in our 4 largest cities, more than 25% of households don't own a car at all. So transportation burden and opportunity cost is compounded by the persistent financial stress that low-income residents of our state experience. So when I say LMI, or low and moderate income, I want to acknowledge the diversity of communities that we're discussing. And we should be thinking broadly about people who might be living in rural, suburban, or urban environments. It could be white, black, brown, multiracial, differently abled, earners of fixed income like Social Security, or earners of variable incomes like a minimum wage job with inconsistent hours. Our clients are often older couples, they're single parents. And this year we've gotten a lot of requests from first-time applicants who have never needed or sought our help before. So we understand that to indicate that what Justine has presented in the study around mapping these burdens is likely much more exaggerated now under COVID than it was before for the most vulnerable residents. So Operation Fuel is concerned about transportation costs in terms of dollars and cents, in terms of public health, environmental outcomes that are related to pollution in low-income communities and communities of color, and also in terms of opportunity cost, medical appointments, access to aid, job opportunities, educational, going to school, social and cultural experiences, so forth, all depend on access to reliable transportation. And in our state, the wealth disparities among residents of the same and neighboring towns, some of the greatest in the country, mean that marginalized people lose out because they can't get farther than a few miles away. So during the pandemic, electricity use and rates in Connecticut have increased, and they're about to go up again in January. I'm sure everybody's thrilled to learn. Record numbers of residents have applied for unemployment in our state, over 1 million unemployment claims in a state of 3.5 million people. Public transportation options have been cut back throughout the pandemic as well. So the study, again, doesn't cover 2020 data, but it describes a state that is suffering even worse now under COVID. And one of the main takeaways from this report that we took is the combined spending burden is unaffordable throughout the state, and we noted the high affordability gaps clustered in New Haven, Bridgeport, and Waterbury. In some areas, this gap exceeds $12,000 a year, or 68% of a household income. And of course, many households don't actually spend that. They just fall behind on bills, rent, electricity, utility bills, et cetera. And this increases folks' housing security. It cuts off their opportunities to save or acquire wealth. We also note that the transportation burden is high throughout the state and really throughout income levels. And one of the big challenges that's driving that, so to speak, is that without a private vehicle, a resident of Connecticut, your mobility is quite limited. So requiring that folks own a car so that they can get to school, work, and doctor's appointments reduces net income, it erodes economic mobility, and our state needs transportation systems that don't shift the cost burden to the lowest income residents and that provide clean and reliable options for everyone. We saw from Justine's presentation that the main drivers of transportation burden in rural areas are centered around the cost of private vehicle ownership and the maintenance costs that go up with vehicle miles traveled. And in urban areas, they're mostly derived around lower incomes that come from decades of policy designed to segregate and disenfranchise poor people. City dwellers are also likely to experience unaffordable energy and housing costs with decades of underinvestment in older, energy inefficient housing stock. We understand that all of these burdens are exaggerated by high unemployment and the COVID pandemic. So VEIC's research points out why it's so important to eliminate perhaps our reliance on private vehicles. I said eliminate our reliance on private vehicles, not necessarily to eliminate private vehicles. But this shift is necessary for environmental, health, economic, and of course, equity reasons. Without intentional intervention, inequality inevitably reproduces. Our state responded to COVID on a dime. It is time for us to confront inequality, racism, and climate change with that same existential urgency. Thank you to our partners at VEIC, the Green Bank, and CISA. We're grateful for the chance to present to you today. And especially thank you to all of you for being here and listening. We're really looking forward to hearing your questions and continuing this conversation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Gannon, Emily, and Justine. We'll now be opening up the question portion of the webinar. So please, if you haven't submitted your questions yet, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So to start off with, you know, Gannon, you mentioned how COVID has impacted, exacerbated these problems for households, but it's also obviously has hit states hard as well. So a lot of states are dealing with being resource constrained. You know, something that for states to consider when considering assistance programs, you know, is what is the most impactful. So for example, with considering the average cost of, say, the Solar for All program versus giving direct assistance for paying energy bills, you know, how should states be prioritizing those two approaches?
And I would I'll leave Emily to get into the details on those. I think they're different approaches, right? So one is a little bit more of a longer term and one is a little bit shorter term. I think one of the challenges that you have in a state that has tremendous wealth inequality is that a lot of the time the folks who are making those types of decisions have really no direct experience with what it's like to be, you know, have lost your job in March, have been $5,000 behind on rent. You know, your utilities are at risk of getting shut off unless you follow a series of steps that can be very scary, you know, calling your utility company, asking for help, applying through a pretty extensive application process, either through the state or through other agencies like Operation Fuel. So I guess I kind of am viewing what you're asking as what's, you know, meeting someone's immediate basic needs. And I think that comes, from my perspective, that really comes before anything. Unfortunately, I don't think that we are taking enough of those steps in Connecticut to do that. And I think if you can look to the news to read about that today in the Connecticut Mirror, there's, you know, we're talking about the eviction crisis that is now underway because people are thousands of dollars behind on rent. You know, there's a lot of examples of how that kind of works out. So I guess depending on the situation, you know, so if we've also seen an incredible amount of generosity that our supporters and other folks around the world, I'm sure, have contributed to just making sure that their neighbors are okay in whatever way. Maybe it's mutual aid, maybe it's contributing to a food bank, maybe it's volunteering, maybe it's contributing to Operation Fuel. So that's also really encouraging to see. But for me, I think basic needs really is important. And as the better that you're able to address that, that helps you address the longer term challenges as well. But I think kind of understanding the stark reality that people are dealing with is really important in this climate, especially considering how comfortable some of us are. It makes it harder to believe that other folks are actually incredibly uncomfortable right now.
Thanks, Gannon. I'll also just add on to that if I could. I agree. I think there's a chart in the presentation that shows that all of these affordability gaps can really compound to show a really stark picture for some people, but we can see a gap for all income bands. So, you know, when we have compounded affordability gaps, that is leaving people with opportunity, you know, cost. They're not able to have the same quality of life as others. So, you know, as Gannon mentioned, that can mean not paying bills and going into debt, going into, you know, utility bill arrears. So there is, you know, crisis points that need to be addressed with more urgency. But all of us across the state need to be helping to address the challenges that we have across, you know, across the state, across income bands, and those are going to need kind of a patchwork of programs. People who are you know, ready to go solar, you know, may not be the people who are walking into Operation Fuel looking for, you know, energy assistance. That may not be a conversation they're ready to have. So we know we've got to have a lot of different tools in our tool belt to start addressing all of the gaps that we see.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think this is something that has been touched on with this question and as well as through the presentation. But, you know, what is the role of debt in all of these burdens, and how, you know, how should states be considering targeting household debt from, you know, going into arrears with utility payments or with car payments or, you know, heating and cooling? You know, how can those be targeted in conjunction with assistance programs?
Yeah, I mean, that has been a big point of focus for the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority over this past year. And that's in part because we have had strict shutoff protections for residents for a long time. Unfortunately, sometimes legislation like that comes about because somebody almost loses their life and you realize that all they needed was electricity, and legislation was passed to protect people after that happened. But we have those protections, and yet there were tens of thousands of people in Connecticut, and it actually doubled within 4 years, of who were getting shut off for their utility bills being overdue. So it has been a problem that has accumulated for a long time. And I think when you're, you know, since COVID, so there's a variety of payment plans people can get into. You know, Operation Fuel can help with some of them. The state aid helps with some of them. Some of them, you know, sometimes they can be an entry point to discussion. Okay, is your household efficient? You know, do you need an energy audit? Do you have weatherization? Are those, you know, how are you using water filters that, you know, conserve water, et cetera? So those are things that, you know, we have not connected so far. And I give PURA, our regulators, a lot of credit for really laying out what's actually happening. And now it's a time for all of the stakeholders to come together, including the utility companies, and figuring out how to make that work for people. Because what happens is people's bills get really behind. And then because of that, the companies come to the regulators and say, okay, we have to increase prices because, you know, we're losing money on these folks. And it's a perpetuating cycle, because the more that the rates go up, of course, the more people can't pay their bills and get behind. And during you know, we've had a moratorium protecting people from shutoffs, but at the same time, your bill is, you know, we haven't connected that to how are we really making sure that anyone who has this moratorium is effectively being reached with, you know, assistance, energy efficiency information, whatever else that we can do to bring down their cost burden. So I'm talking specifically around the energy burden situation, because that's where I'm focused right now with Operation Fuel. There's obviously, you know, housing and transportation also really important. And I think for transportation, a lot of the time, it's not that necessarily you're behind. I suppose people could be behind on their cars, but then they just get repossessed, right? But the real transportation cost is the opportunity cost. It's not that you're spending too much to get somewhere, it's that you're not going. And what does that mean for your life? Because you can't get to that job, you can't get to that school.
Yeah, there's something that Gannon said earlier that I think is worth just reiterating, that we see with our regulator and also our utilities and our SCEF or community solar program here, really prioritizing those benefits for those who need it most, and they're interpreting that as our lower income folks, or folks that are repeatedly participating in energy assistance programs, and they're really using those types of, we're seeing that baked into policy, we're seeing that baked into program design, that we need to start addressing folks that have arrears or are constantly needing assistance to help bring those benefits back around of clean energy. And that's really important to help chip away at the debt that they're accumulating, because we have expensive electricity costs. But the another side of the coin is that in Connecticut, we have such old housing stock that we're not addressing the home that also has really terrible weatherization. So we've got to continue to deepen the programs that weatherize homes, so that those bills aren't high to begin with. So we've really got to think about how can we stitch these programs together, how can we layer them together to do the deeper energy efficiency work and the home improvement work for our, small multifamily, for our renters. A lot of, programs fit neatly for our homeowners. They have the ability to make the decision about what technologies can be introduced in their home, and there's programs that help them pay for that. But we're still leaving some segments behind. So there's a lot of work to do.
No, definitely. And so kind of related to all of that, for the study, did you all look at sort of drivers of wealth and income inequality, for example, racist housing policy through redlining, or other sorts of intersectional issues, and how did that impact the affordability gaps in these communities?
I can answer that. No, we did not look at race. We just looked at income and location. And I think that we were talking about this, I think last week. So the scope of work for this study was finalized in like December 2019, January 2020, and then 2020 happened and like imploded. So the study doesn't talk about COVID, it doesn't mention structural racism, and those are just glaring omissions, I think, that are worth revisiting. And yeah, so that not that structural racism wasn't an issue before 2020, but it's certainly a part of every conversation now, and it should be. And I've thought about it a bit. The data source that we used, I don't think has, I don't think it includes race as a variable. So I think we would have to get at it in a different way. But it's definitely on our radar to revisit that.
Great. And so getting into the transportation burden specifically, I think you got to this a little bit. Transportation affordability is definitely a harder variable to measure. For example, for folks that are living in areas with limited public transit, but who can't afford to buy a personal vehicle, they might be spending money on rideshare apps like Uber or Lyft. And that's obviously much more difficult to get access to that sort of data. So, one, how can states kind of better understand and sort of typify those needs? And then how can programs be structured to really get at folks like that? I know you mentioned things like, rebates for EV vehicles, but obviously for low-income households who may not be in a position to purchase a vehicle in the first place, even with, state assistance, that probably isn't going to cut it. And, even with EV bikes, I'm sure in Connecticut, it's not great weather to be riding a bike all year round. Definitely isn't in Maine where I am. So, what are other ways that states can can structure programs to meet those needs as well?
Yeah, I mean, the answer that comes to the top of my mind is not a flashy answer that anybody ever wants, but it's access to transit. It's offering people options that does not involve getting in a car that they own. I think, yeah, rideshare was not, that's generally proprietary data. It's very hard to come by, but it was not included in this analysis. There's a little bit of it out there. I think it's, it's worth adding as a discussion. And it's true. And I think what's tricky about transportation is there is not one solution that's going to work, right? And once you get into the nuance, it gets you start to lose people a little bit. But clearly, different areas need different solutions. There's not one that's going to work for every household everywhere, and that's okay. As long as there are lots of options and they're available to everyone, then you have a more equitable system. So maybe in rural areas, it's a low-income electric vehicle program. Maybe in urban areas, the focus is on transit, making sure you have weekend service, late night service. And yes, absolutely. We have snow on the ground here in Vermont. My e-bike would not be very helpful today, but the truth is it's helpful like 8 months out of the year, which is a lot of months. And I think is worth thinking about. It's way cheaper than owning a car. I don't know that we want every household in Connecticut to have their own personal vehicle. I don't think that's a goal anyone is working towards. So we need to get at it another way.
Yeah, I would just kind of echo the question that I'd be very interested to see more information about how, the ride sharing network is supporting different communities. And there's an argument to be made about the greenhouse gas emissions from having that be kind of a Band-Aid solution to people's transportation needs than actually having comprehensive transit. I'd be very interested to see that.
I think we need a really radical rethinking of transportation. We have invested really regressively the money of everyone, including low-income communities, in structures like highways that have been really designed to serve higher income communities. And not just like in a zero-sum way, like in a really like low-income communities have been polluted, disrupted, houses raised in order to support those structures that just reproduce inequality with everything they do. They're bad for greenhouse gases, they're bad for the environment, and they're bad for neighborhoods. And so I think we need a completely different way of thinking about it. And we need to be thinking about how are we spending resources that poor people pay into to subsidize services for richer people. And that highways, whether you put an electric vehicle on them, a hybrid vehicle on them, whatever else, it's the highway itself is actually the structure that's producing the inequities. And Hartford is a great example of that. There are many other cities across the country that also are, kind of stemming back to your redlining question from before, Abby. So that's, it's not an easy answer like Justine. I didn't have a quick one for that, but that's really important. And I guess is another thing that I see really close up hand. I think this is definitely the case with transportation in Connecticut, where you look at, we have one state Department of Transportation, we have 12 different transit agencies across the state. Literally, Hartford, New Haven, and Middletown each have their own different transit agency that runs a different system. Our state compared to most would be the size of a county. So that's like a really, it's a sort of glaring inefficiency in a lot of ways. And in energy, a similar situation meets people when they seek assistance or when they seek energy, advice. There's one website for efficiency stuff. There's a different website for weatherization. There's one place you go to get, assistance. There's another one that you go to get, to get weatherization or to get other services. Sometimes the home has too many health hazards in it that you can't even receive those services, even though as a ratepayer, you're paying into the fund that supports them. So there's a lot of ways that I think just broadly states can look at, how do we develop a no wrong door, where if somebody applies for healthcare or for food benefits, they're automatically enrolled in energy benefits too, or they automatically get also a transportation voucher or a free bus pass or whatever that might be. How do we eliminate all of that? Because a lot of it is just administrative bureaucracy, and that limits our efficiency, and it limits how much we actually have to spend, because we're not spending our resources wisely. So I think those things are really important. And the more that you're able to bring folks to the table that experience the problems that you're trying to address, the better you'll be able to address them. Because if it's just a bunch of people sitting around talking hypothetically, you're not really going to get to the bottom of the challenge that people are living in their daily lives.
No, that's a great point, Gannon. And I know we're at the top of the hour, so I don't want to hold anyone too much longer. I did have one final question for you all, and I can stay a few minutes after. that I think is relevant for this entire discussion, which is, you know, in Connecticut, you have the GC3 recommendations on climate change. I think this is an issue a lot of states are thinking about, particularly as they're also resource constrained by COVID. So, you know, how do things like the results of this report really inform and compel action under GC3 or for states looking at reducing their GHG emissions overall?
Yeah, I'll just give a quick answer that the real, you know, when you boil it down, this report gives you the dollar amounts and the areas where, you know, average gap is. And these are numbers that we need to start using when we start giving recommendations. We can integrate this information into how big do we need to expand programs, where do they need to go. This is a report that helps us understand, you know, how we can more efficiently deliver, you know, our resources. So I think that's where this really is helpful.
Yeah, and I think it also brings together a lot of different groups of people that can be working on these issues together, whether it's, you know, clean energy, energy affordability, efficiency, you know, greenhouse gas emission reductions, all of these types of things. So showing what the daily lived experience of people is gives you the opportunity to bring different groups together and explain how, you know, how this is impacting your life, and in a really concrete way, kind of breaking through the abstraction of negotiation and politics sometimes, I hope. So I think that's really it, is just showing people exactly what is happening, exactly where it's happening, and seeing how you can address it together.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. You know, we have a ton of questions in the chat that I don't think we'll be able to get to unless you wanted to be here for the rest of the day. But this has been great. Gannon, Justine, Emily, thank you so much for sharing your findings and for being here with us this afternoon. And I will turn it over to Sam to just go over any closeout logistics.
Hey, thank you, Abby. And thank you again to all of our panelists. You guys were great. This was very informative. Before people head out for the day, I just want to let you know that this was the last webinar of 2020. We've got a lot of webinars that we are working on for 2021. You can see a couple of those on your screen now, a few that we've got scheduled in January. So if you visit our website, cisa.org/webinars, you can read more about those webinars and sign up. So thank you all for being here today. We look forward to seeing you at our webinars in 2021. Bye, everyone.
Bye.